"Can I eat your bread?" The little daughter of the housekeeper was starving, and the boss's response hurt. Subscribe to the channel and comment where you are watching from. The sweltering heat of January in Los Angeles turned Edward Smith's mansion in the Hollywood Hills into a marble and crystal greenhouse. It was 3 in the afternoon when the thermometer read 107 degrees Fahrenheit, and even the central air conditioning could not completely alleviate the weight of the humidity that clung to the skin like a second layer of clothing. Edward adjusted the knot of his Hermes tie as he walked down the main hallway of the house, his footsteps echoing on the Carrara marble floor he had imported directly from Italy. At 53 years old, he commanded an empire of construction companies that built some of the most imposing buildings in Santa Monica and Venice Beach. His posture was always upright, his broad shoulders supported by the military discipline he had learned in his youth, and his gray eyes rarely showed any emotion that could be interpreted as weakness. The mansion reflected his personality, impeccable, grand, and distant. With 2,000 square feet of built area, the house boasted gardens designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, an Olympic-sized pool overlooking Griffith Park, and furniture signed by the most renowned designers in the country. Each room was a work of architectural art, but it lacked something that money could not buy: human warmth. At that moment, Edward was reviewing important contracts in his office when he heard hesitant footsteps coming from the direction of the kitchen. It was a sound different from the firm heels of Rachel, the housekeeper who had worked there for 2 years. These were tiny, almost imperceptible steps of someone walking cautiously. Rachel Green, 39 years old, was a woman of medium height, with brown hair always neatly tied in a bun and hands calloused from domestic work. Her face carried the simple beauty of rural California, from where she had migrated after losing her previous job at a company that went bankrupt during the economic crisis. Her brown eyes, although always attentive and respectful, hid an intelligence that rarely had the opportunity to manifest in that environment. She was in the service area, folding the freshly ironed clothes of the family when she noticed that her son was no longer playing in the small back room where he usually stayed during her working hours. Her heart tightened immediately. Charlie was only 6 years old, but he already displayed a natural curiosity that sometimes led him to explore corners of the house where he should not be. "Charlie? Charlie, where are you, my love?" she murmured softly, trying not to draw attention from the employers. The boy had appeared in her life like an unexpected gift and a constant challenge. Small for his age, with dark curly hair that never stayed combed for long and big eyes that seemed to absorb every detail of the world around him, Charlie possessed a precocious intelligence that sometimes surprised even his mother. His father had disappeared before he was born, leaving Rachel to raise her son alone with the strength and determination that only single mothers know. That afternoon, the boy's stomach had been growling for hours. The morning coffee had only been a glass of milk with sugar and a piece of baguette, and lunch would only be after 5, when Rachel finished her shift and they returned to their small one-bedroom apartment in East Los Angeles, an hour-and-a-half bus ride from there. Edward was focused on a cost spreadsheet when he heard a soft knock on the office door. It was such a delicate sound that he almost didn't notice it. He lifted his eyes from the documents and saw a tiny figure standing in the doorway. Charlie was there, barefoot, wearing a faded Los Angeles Lakers t-shirt and shorts that were already too small for him. "What do you want here, kid?" Edward asked, not hiding the irritation in his voice. "Didn't your mother teach you not to bother people when they're working?" Charlie swallowed hard, his small fingers nervously playing with the hem of his t-shirt. He had caught the delicious smell of the lunch the cook was preparing for the family, grilled chicken with vegetables that made his mouth water, and hunger had overcome fear. "Sorry, Mr. Edward," the boy said in a low voice, using the respectful address his mother had taught him. "It's just that I'm really hungry, and Mom said we can only have lunch when she finishes working." Edward stopped writing and stared at the boy. There was something in the simplicity of those words that bothered him in a way he couldn't explain. For a moment, his mind drifted back to his own childhood, when he had known hunger and the humiliation of asking. "And what do you want me to do about it?" he replied coldly, turning his attention back to the papers. "Your mother is paid to work, not to make snacks for kids during work hours." But Charlie did not give up. He took a small step into the office, his sweaty little hands gripping the hem of his t-shirt tighter. "Mr. Edward," he said, with a courage that only children possess when need speaks louder than fear. Can I just have a little piece? I promise I won't bother anyone. Just a tiny piece. The silence that followed seemed to last an eternity. Edward raised his eyes again, and this time he truly saw the boy in front of him. He saw the big, hopeful eyes, saw the childish thinness hidden under the simple clothing, saw the dignity with which the child made his request. And for an instant, just an instant, he felt something stir within his chest, as if a door long locked was trying to open. But the rigid upbringing, the years of business discipline, and the fear of appearing. The weak voice spoke louder. "Go back to your place and wait for your mother to finish her work," he said dryly, without lifting his eyes from the documents. "And don't show up in my office unless called. This is not a play area." Charlie lowered his eyes, tears beginning to form. He took a step back, then another, and murmured an almost inaudible "Sorry, Mr. Edward," before running off toward the back of the house. Edward continued pretending to read the same paragraph for several minutes, but the words seemed to dance on the page. Something about that encounter had stirred him in a way that hadn't happened in many years, awakening memories he preferred to keep buried deep in his mind. Outside, the heat remained relentless, and in the kitchen, Rachel was desperately searching for her son, unaware that the first meeting of a story that would forever change the lives of everyone in that house had just occurred. Rachel found Charlie curled up behind the washing machine, in the darkest corner of the laundry room, with his little face wet from tears that he tried to hide with his small hands. Her heart broke at the sight of her son in that state, and she immediately knew something had happened. "My love, what's wrong? Why are you crying?" she asked, kneeling beside him and pulling him into a tight embrace. "Mommy, I just wanted a little bit of food," Charlie sobbed against her chest. "My tummy hurts from being so hungry, and I asked Mr. Edward if I could just have a tiny bit, but he got mad at me." Rachel closed her eyes, feeling a mix of shame, anger, and sadness that almost made her crumble. She knew how hard it was for a 6-year-old to understand why there was so much food in that house, and he couldn't eat any of it. How could she explain to a boy that there was an invisible line separating those who can and those who cannot? "Charlie, you can't just walk around the house like that, sweetheart. I've talked to you about this," she said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "Mommy works here, but that doesn't mean the house is ours." "But Mommy, why does Mr. Edward have so much food and we can't eat even a little? Doesn't he like kids?" Her son's innocent question echoed in Rachel's mind like a punch to the stomach. How could she respond without destroying the purity of that child's heart? How to explain that the world was divided between those who have and those who serve those who have? Meanwhile, in the office, Edward tried to focus on the contracts, but he couldn't shake off the encounter with the boy. There was something in the desperate courage of the child that deeply unsettled him. He stood up from the chair and walked to the window overlooking the garden, where the palm trees swayed gently in the warm afternoon breeze. His mind involuntarily drifted back to his own childhood in Los Angeles, when he was just Edward Smith, the son of a housekeeper and a father he never knew. He remembered the afternoons spent accompanying his mother, Mrs. Conception, to the houses where she worked, and how he himself had gone hungry on many occasions. The difference was that he had never had the courage to ask the employers for food. He preferred to go hungry than to face humiliation. But that boy had been brave enough to ask, and he had been cruel enough to deny. Edward, the soft voice of his adoptive mother, Mrs. Helena, 80 years old, brought him back to the present. She was standing in the doorway of the office, leaning on her carved wooden cane, watching him with those blue eyes that still held the vibrancy of youth. Mrs. Helena Smith was not his biological mother, but she had been the only maternal figure that truly mattered in his life. She had found him at 12, when he was living on the streets after his mother's death, and brought him home against her husband's wishes. She was the one who educated him, who gave him opportunities, and who taught him both the values of an upper-class family and the responsibilities that came with it. "Yes, Mom," Edward replied, returning to his chair. "I just heard a cry coming from the back of the house. Did something happen to Rachel's son?" Edward hesitated for a moment. Mrs. Helena always had a keen perception for matters involving children, perhaps because she had never been able to have biological children. She had adopted not only Edward but also his sister Patricia, 2 years younger, raising them with the rigor of a traditional family, but also with genuine love. "The boy came here to bother me during work. He said he was hungry and wanted food. I told him to go back to his place. Mrs. Helena fell silent for a few seconds, studying her adoptive son's face. She knew Edward better than he knew himself and could recognize when something was troubling him more than it should. Edward, do you remember when you arrived here? You were the same age as that boy, maybe a little older. Do you remember what you told me on your first night? Mom, that was over 40 years ago. You said you would rather go hungry than ask strangers for food, that your mother had taught you to have pride, even in misery. Mrs. Helena entered the office and sat in the armchair in front of his desk. But that boy had the courage to ask. That says something about him, don't you think? Edward sighed, running his hands through his gray hair that he still kept neatly cut and styled. He didn't like to talk about the past, especially about the hard times. He had worked too hard to forget those memories. Mom, I understand what you're trying to say, but I can't set a precedent. If I start in feeding the employee's child, where will this lead? I have responsibilities, I have a social standing to maintain. Social standing, Mrs. Helen repeated, shaking her head slowly. Sometimes I wonder if that's what I taught you, or if that's what you learned on your own along the way. At that moment, they heard firm footsteps in the hallway. Patricia Smith entered the house with her children, Michael and Caroline, aged 15 and 13 respectively. At 51, Patricia had inherited the classic beauty of her adoptive family, but she had also developed a voracious ambition that sometimes worried her own mother. Divorced for 3 years, she and her children visited the mansion almost daily, officially to keep Mrs. Helen company, but everyone knew she was eyeing the inheritance. Hi, Mom. Hi, Edward. Patricia shouted from the living room, her voice echoing through the hallways. I came to pick up the documents you promised me, remember? About the apartment in Malibu? Edward exchanged a tired glance with Mrs. Helen. Patricia was always after some financial favor, always with some emergency that only he could resolve. It was as if she had completely forgotten the family's humble origins and now only cared about maintaining the lifestyle that adoption had provided her. I'll talk to her, Edward said, getting up. Before you do, Mrs. Helen said, holding him by the arm with surprising strength for her age. Think about what we discussed. Sometimes, son, the greatest wealth we can have is not what we keep, but what we share. As Edward left the office to deal with his sister's requests, Rachel managed to calm Charlie and returned to work, but with a heavy heart. She knew that this episode was just the beginning of something bigger. Hunger wouldn't go away just because the boss said no, and she didn't know how much longer she could explain to her son why they always had to live on the margins of the abundance that surrounded them. The afternoon heat continued relentlessly, but inside the mansion, a much more complex storm was just beginning to form. 3 months had passed since the meeting in the office, and March had arrived in Los Angeles, bringing the first rains of the autumn season. The leaves of the mango trees in the garden were starting to yellow, creating a golden carpet that contrasted with the intense green of the English grass that Edward insisted on keeping immaculate. The routine in the mansion seemed to follow normally. Charlie had learned not to approach the boss's office and spent his afternoons quietly playing in the back room, building imaginary castles with pieces of wood and empty boxes he found in the service area. Rachel continued her work with her usual efficiency, but something had changed in her eyes, a subtle sadness that she tried to hide behind forced smiles. Mrs. Helen, for her part, had begun to observe the dynamics of the house more closely. At 80, she possessed the wisdom of someone who had lived long enough to recognize when something important was happening beneath the surface of appearances. On that particular day, a rainy Thursday, Mrs. Helen finally decided to tidy up the mansion's attic. It was a task she had been postponing for years, but the doctor had recommended light activities to keep her moving. She climbed the narrow staircase leading to the top floor of the house, where dozens of trunks, antique furniture, and dusty documents held the history of decades. Rachel, dear, can you come help me up here? She shouted, her voice echoing through the stairwell. Rachel interrupted her tidying of the library and quickly ascended, worried. She found Mrs. Helen amid a mountain of old papers, yellowed photographs, and objects that seemed to have been forgotten by time. Mrs. Helen, you shouldn't be doing this alone. What if you slipped or got hurt? Nonsense, my dear. I'm stronger than many young people around. The lady laughed, but accepted the arm Rachel offered to help her sit in an old chair. I just need someone with better eyesight than mine to help me separate what's useful from what's not. It was Rachel's first time in the attic, and she was impressed by the amount of accumulated objects there. There were period furniture, framed paintings, fine china stored in wooden boxes, and, above all, documents. Many documents. What a beautiful history this house must have, Rachel murmured, gently picking up a black and white photograph showing an elegant family posing in front of the mansion. Oh, my dear, if these walls could talk, sighed Mrs. Helen. This house has seen a lot. Joys, sorrows, births, deaths, and secrets too. Rachel began organizing the papers by date, always careful not to damage anything. There were birth certificates, property documents, old correspondence, and family records dating back to the early 20th century. It was then that her hands touched a worn leather folder, tied with a faded satin ribbon. Mrs. Helen, what are these documents here? She asked, showing the folder. The lady adjusted her glasses and examined the material. Oh, these are very old family papers. Things from my father-in-law, the patriarch of the Smith family. He was always very meticulous with documentation. Rachel carefully opened the folder and began examining the papers. There were handwritten family trees, marriage and baptism certificates, and records of rural properties in the interior of California. Her attention was drawn to a specific document, a birth certificate from 1920 for someone named Anthony Smith. Anthony Smith, she read aloud, furrowing her brow. Mrs. Helen, that name sounds familiar. Let me see, the lady said, taking the document with trembling hands. When she read the full name, her expression changed completely. My God, Anthony was my father-in-law's brother. He disappeared in the 1940s. The whole family searched, but they never heard from him again. Rachel felt a shiver run down her spine. Smith was her last name, and her grandmother had always told. Once upon a time, there were stories about an uncle who had disappeared when he was young, leaving for Los Angeles and never returning. Mrs. Helen, he said in a low voice, my grandmother always spoke of an Uncle Anthony who vanished when she was young. Her name was Mary Green, born in 1925 in a small town in California. The two pairs of eyes met in a moment of silence filled with possibilities. Mrs. Helen took another paper from the folder, a handwritten letter dated 1943. Here it is, she said, her voice choked with emotion. A letter that Anthony wrote to his brother before he disappeared. He says he was going to work on coffee farms and that he would send news. But if anything happened to him, they should take care of the family he left behind in a small town. A sister named Mary and some little nephews. Rachel sat heavily on a nearby box, her heart racing. The pieces of a puzzle she didn't even know existed began to fit together disturbingly. Mrs. Helen, this would mean that you could be the great-granddaughter of the lost brother of the patriarch of the Smith family. The lady completed, her voice heavy with emotion. My dear, you may be related to us. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of rain hitting the roof and the footsteps of Charlie, who was climbing the stairs looking for his mother. Mommy, where are you? The boy shouted, his little voice echoing through the basement. I'm here, my love, Rachel replied, still dazed by the discovery. When Charlie appeared at the top of the stairs, Mrs. Helen looked at him with completely different eyes. If the suspicions were confirmed, that boy who had asked for a piece of food would actually be the great-great-grandson of the founder of that fortune. Come here, my grandson, she said, extending her arms to Charlie, who ran into the embrace without hesitation. Rachel watched the scene with tears in her eyes, unsure whether to feel relief or terror. Discovering that she might be related to the family could change everything, but it could also complicate an already delicate situation even further. Mrs. Helen, what do we do now? How do we find out if this is true? The lady held Rachel's hands between hers, feeling them tremble. First, we will carefully check these documents. Then, if necessary, we will do a DNA test. But one thing I can tell you, my dear, whether true or not, you and this boy have already earned a special place in my heart. As the rainy afternoon turned into night, downstairs Edward was working on his contracts, completely unaware of the discovery happening right above his head. A discovery that, when it came to light, would shake all the certainties about family, social class, and rights he had built throughout his life. Outside, the first cold winds of autumn were announcing that changes were coming. and some of them would be deeper than anyone could imagine. The discovery in the basement remained a secret between Mrs. Helen and Rachel for 2 weeks, until the pressure of keeping something so important hidden began to weigh on both of them. It was an April morning, with the mild weather typical of autumn, when Patricia arrived at the mansion earlier than usual, bringing Michael and Caroline for another of their family visits. Patricia Smith had developed a keen instinct over the years to sense when something was different in the household's dynamics. Perhaps it was the result of her constant worry about maintaining her position in the family, or perhaps it was simply the natural paranoia of someone who always feared losing her privileges. That day, she immediately noticed a different intimacy between her grandmother and the housekeeper. "Grandma, why is Rachel eating at the kitchen table?" asked Caroline, her 13-year-old daughter, upon finding Rachel and Charlie having breakfast at the table where only kitchen staff usually sat. "Because I invited her, my granddaughter," Mrs. Helen replied naturally, but Patricia sensed something in her mother's voice that put her on alert. Michael, Patricia's eldest son, was in the living room fiddling with his phone when he heard his grandmother call Charlie my grandson for the second time that morning. At 15, he had inherited from his mother the ability to sense when something could affect his interests. "Mom," he whispered to Patricia as she approached, "why is Grandma treating the maid's boy like he's family?" Patricia decided to investigate. She quietly approached the kitchen and listened behind the door when she heard Mrs. Helen talking to Rachel about important documents and necessary confirmations. That afternoon, while Edward was in a business meeting downtown, Patricia confronted her mother directly. "Mom, what's going on here? Why are you treating the housekeeper and her son differently?" Mrs. Helen was embroidering in the living room, an activity that calmed her during tense moments. She looked up at her daughter and saw the same hardness in her eyes that she sometimes recognized in Edward. "Patricia, sit down. We have something important to discuss. If it has to do with changes in the staff, you should talk to Edward first. He is the one who makes the decisions about the household. These are not decisions about staff, my daughter. It's about family." Patricia felt her stomach tighten. The word family always made her nervous when accompanied by that serious tone from her mother. "What family? What are you talking about?" Mrs. Helen then told her about the discovery in the basement, about the documents found, and about the possibility of Rachel being a direct descendant of Anthony Smith. With each word, Patricia's face grew paler, and her fists clenched tighter. "Are you telling me," Patricia said with a controlled but trembling voice of anger, "that this woman could be our relative? Our blood relative? It's a possibility that needs to be investigated, yes." Patricia abruptly stood up, walking away. Rachel paced from one side of the room to the other like a caged lioness. "Mom, you can't be serious. This woman just showed up out of nowhere, has been working as a housekeeper for 2 years, and now, suddenly, she could be our family? How convenient." "Patricia, the documents are authentic. I recognize them myself. Documents can be forged, Mom. You're being naive." Patricia's voice rose dangerously in pitch. "This woman found a loophole and is trying to take advantage of your kindness. And you are falling right into her trap." At that moment, Rachel appeared at the door, bringing the afternoon tea that Mrs. Helen had requested. She had overheard part of the argument, and her face showed a mix of shame and pain. "Excuse me, Mrs. Helen. I'll leave the tea here and take my leave." "No, Rachel, come in. Patricia needs to hear your side of the story." Patricia turned to Rachel with eyes blazing with fury. "Your side of the story? What side is that? That you just happened to discover you could be our relative, and now you're going to try to cling to our inheritance?" "Patricia," Mrs. Helen scolded, but her daughter was out of control. "No, Mom. I won't stay quiet while an opportunist tries to destroy our family." She stepped closer to Rachel, who remained motionless by the table. "Did you think you could fool an 80-year-old woman? Did you think you could get your dirty hands on our money?" "Mrs. Patricia," Rachel said with dignity, despite the tears beginning to form in her eyes, "I never asked for anything. It was Mrs. Helen who found the documents and showed them to me. I didn't even know they existed." "Of course you didn't know," Patricia shouted. "Because you planted them there, didn't you? Or maybe you made up this whole story about your grandmother and that mysterious uncle." "Enough, Patricia." Mrs. Helen slammed her cane on the floor with force. "You are behaving shamefully." But Patricia was blinded by rage and fear. Fear of losing her position, fear of having to share the inheritance, fear that her children wouldn't have the future she had planned for them. Shameful is this situation. A housekeeper trying to pass herself off as family, and you believing this farce. It was at that moment that Charlie appeared in the room, drawn by the sound of raised voices. The boy stopped at the entrance, his big eyes immediately capturing the tension in the atmosphere. "Mommy, why is the lady shouting?" he asked innocently. Patricia looked at the boy, and her fury reached its peak. This kid is part of the plan too, isn't he? Children always evoke pity in people. "Patricia," Mrs. Helen shouted, struggling to stand. "You've crossed the line. That boy is not to blame for anything." Rachel pulled Charlie close to her, instinctively protecting him from Patricia's hostility. "Mrs. Patricia, please don't speak like that in front of my son. He's just a child that you're using to get what you want. But I'm not going to let that happen." Patricia grabbed her cell phone. "I'm calling Edward right now. He needs to know what's happening in his own house." Michael and Caroline appeared at the entrance, drawn by the commotion. Both looked at the scene without fully understanding, but sensing that something serious was happening. "Mom," Michael said cautiously, "what's going on?" "Your uncle needs to know that there are imposters trying to infiltrate our family," Patricia said, dialing Edward's number. Rachel held Charlie's hand tighter, feeling that the storm approaching would be much worse than anything they had ever faced. The boy, frightened by the hostility in the room, buried his face in his mother's dress. Outside, the dark clouds of late afternoon perfectly mirrored the mood inside the mansion, where revealed secrets were about to cause an explosion that would forever change the lives of everyone involved. Edward arrived at the mansion 20 minutes after Patricia's call, driving his silver BMW at high speed through the winding streets of the upscale neighborhood. The phone call had been confusing, filled with accusations and shouting, but he had understood enough to know that something very serious was happening at home. He found the living room in a state of almost palpable tension. Mrs. Helen was sitting in her favorite armchair, her face pale and her trembling hands gripping her cane. Patricia was pacing back and forth like a wounded animal, while Michael and Caroline leaned against the wall, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Rachel was by the window, holding Charlie against her, both visibly shaken. "Can someone explain to me what the hell is going on here?" Edward asked, his voice echoing through the room with authority. "Edward, thank God you're here." Patricia rushed toward her brother. "You won't believe what I've discovered. This woman," she said, pointing at Rachel, "is trying to pass herself off as our relative. She made up a crazy story about being a descendant of the family and managed to convince Mom." Edward looked around the room, trying to process the information. His gaze stopped on Rachel, who kept her head down, and then on his mother, who avoided looking at him directly. "Mom," he said, his voice controlled but dangerous, "is what Patricia is saying true?" Mrs. Helen took a deep breath before responding. "Edward, sit down. This will take time to explain. I'd prefer to stand. And I want an explanation now." Mrs. Helen then recounted the discovery in the attic, the documents found, and the possible connection between Rachel and Anthony Smith. With each word, Edward's expression grew darker. "And you," he said, turning to Rachel, "what do you have to say about this?" Rachel lifted her eyes for the first time since he arrived. Her eyes were red from crying, but there was a wounded dignity in her posture that caught his attention. "Mr. Edward," she said in a low but firm voice, "I swear on everything that it is sacred that I knew nothing about this. It was Mrs. Helen who found the documents and showed them to me. I never, at any moment, invented or forged anything." "Of course, you're going to say that," interrupted Patricia. "She's not stupid, Edward. She knows very well how to get rid of the accusations." "Patricia, shut up for a minute," Edward shouted, startling everyone. He rarely lost control like that. "Let me finish understanding this situation before you continue with your accusations." He picked up the documents that were on the coffee table and examined them carefully. His experience in business had taught him to analyze papers with attention to detail, and those documents seemed genuinely old. "These papers are authentic," he murmured, more to himself than to the others. "Old documents are easy to find in second-hand shops and antique stores." Patricia said desperately, "Edward, you can't be seriously considering this possibility." "And why couldn't I?" he asked, surprising everyone, including himself. "If the documents are true, if the dates match, if the names check out." "Because it's impossible," Patricia shouted. "Because it doesn't make sense. Because it would be too big of a coincidence." Or maybe, Mrs. Helen said softly, it's destiny giving us a chance to correct an old injustice. Edward looked at his mother, then at his sister, and finally at Rachel and Charlie. The boy was clearly scared, clinging to his mother's legs as if expecting something terrible to happen at any moment. There is a way to find out the truth, Edward finally said. DNA test. Exactly, Patricia quickly agreed. Let's do that test right away and put an end to this farce once and for all. But until the results come out, Edward continued, ignoring his sister, things will remain as they are. Rachel will continue working normally, and no one will treat her differently because of this possibility. Edward, Patricia protested. You can't be serious. I am very serious. And you, Patricia, will control your tongue and treat Rachel with the respect that anyone deserves. I will not tolerate any more personal attacks. Patricia was taken aback. She didn't expect her brother to take this stance. Have you lost your mind? Are you defending a stranger against your own sister? I am defending basic decency, Edward replied coldly. And if you can't understand the difference, maybe you should rethink your values. My values? Patricia laughed bitterly. My values are to protect our family. Our real family. Not these people who showed up out of nowhere with convenient stories. Mrs. Patricia, Rachel said softly, making everyone look at her. I understand your concern. I understand that this must be very hard to accept. But I am not trying to take anything from anyone. I just want to continue working honestly to support my son. Honestly, Patricia exploded. There's nothing honest about this situation. Enough, Edward shouted with such force that even the pictures on the walls seemed to tremble. Patricia, either you control yourself or I will ask you to leave my house. The silence that followed was deafening. Patricia looked at her brother in shock and hurt, unable to believe he was throwing her out. Your house? She said with a trembling voice. This has always been our house, Edward. Our family home. And it still is. But I will not allow you to turn this house into a battleground because of paranoia and greed. Patricia gathered her bag with trembling hands, her eyes filled with tears of anger. You will regret this, Edward. When you find out that this woman is a fraud, you will remember my words. Michael, Caroline, let's go, she said to her children, who approached her without fully understanding the situation. Before leaving, Patricia stopped at the door and looked one last time at Rachel. I hope you are ready for the consequences when the truth comes to light, she said with venom in her voice. After Patricia and her children's tumultuous departure, the room was immersed in a heavy silence. Edward stood in the center of the room, still processing everything that had happened. Mrs. Helen sighed deeply, clearly exhausted from the confrontation. Rachel, Edward finally said, tomorrow we will arrange for the DNA test. I want this issue resolved as quickly as possible. Yes, Mr. Edward, she murmured. And until then, you and your son will not suffer any kind of retaliation or different treatment. That is an order. Charlie, who had remained silent throughout the discussion, finally spoke. Mommy, why was that lady mad at us? The child's innocent question echoed through the room like a painful reminder that, at the center of all this storm of emotions and interests, there was a 6-year-old boy who just wanted to understand the world around him. Sometimes, my love, Rachel replied, stroking her son's hair. People get scared when things change. But don't worry, everything will be fine. Edward watched the interaction between mother and son, and something inside him moved again. Perhaps it was compassion, perhaps it was the memory of his own difficult childhood, or perhaps it was just the recognition that some situations transcend issues of class and money. What he didn't know was that the storm of that day was just the beginning of a series of events that would test not only blood ties, but also the true nature of what it means to be a family. 2 weeks passed since the confrontation with Patricia, and the tension in the mansion had only superficially decreased. The DNA test had been collected and sent to a private laboratory in a neighborhood in Los Angeles, with results expected in 15 days. During this waiting period, a strange routine had settled in the house. Everyone knew about the possibility, but no one spoke openly about it. Edward had returned to his work routine, but something had changed in his behavior. He observed Rachel more closely, noticing details that had previously gone unnoticed. The way she organized the papers in her office, always in order. It was alphabetical, just as he used to do. The way she spoke softly when she was focused, a habit he recognized in himself. and mainly, the dignity with which she faced the whole situation. Charlie, for his part, had become quieter since the day of the argument. The boy realized that his presence somehow caused problems, and now he hid even more in the back of the house, trying to be invisible. It was a Thursday morning when the first sign that something was wrong appeared. Rachel was preparing coffee in the kitchen when she heard a strange sound coming from the small room where Charlie used to play. It was a low, almost inaudible whimper. "Charlie? My love? Are you okay?" she called, wiping her hands on her apron before rushing to the back of the house. She found her son curled up on the floor, hugging his stomach and with a face as pale as paper. He was trying to hold back tears, but it was evident that he was feeling unwell. "Mommy, my stomach hurts a lot," he murmured, his voice weak and trembling. Rachel knelt beside her son and touched his forehead. He was burning with fever. "Since when have you been feeling bad, my angel?" "Since last night. But I didn't want to say anything because you were already sad about the arguments." Rachel's heart broke as she realized that her 6-year-old son was trying to protect her, hiding his pain so as not to add more worries to their already complicated life. "Charlie, you should never hide when you're sick, understood?" "Never," she said, picking him up in her arms. The boy was lighter than he should be for his age, and she realized, with horror, that he had visibly lost weight in recent weeks. Rachel carried Charlie to the kitchen, where it was cooler, and tried to get him to drink some water. But the boy immediately vomited, and she noticed that there was blood in the vomit. "My God," she murmured, trying to control her panic. "I need to take you to the hospital now." At that moment, Edward came down to have his morning coffee and found the scene. Rachel holding Charlie, who was clearly very sick, both on the kitchen floor. "What happened?" he asked, quickly approaching. "Mr. Edward, my son is very sick. He has a high fever and is vomiting blood. I need to take him to the hospital urgently, but—" She hesitated, the financial reality hitting like a punch. "But I don't have money to pay for a private hospital, and the nearest public hospital is too far." Edward looked at the boy in his mother's arms. Charlie was semi-conscious, breathing with difficulty. Something inside him stirred. Perhaps it was paternal instinct. Perhaps it was basic humanity. Or perhaps it was the memory of his own childhood when he had been sick and there was no one to help his mother. "Let's take him in my car. Now," he said, grabbing the keys to the BMW without hesitation. "Mr. Edward, but don't argue with me right now, Rachel. The boy needs urgent medical help." The trip to St. Mary's Hospital was tense and silent. Edward drove over the speed limit, skillfully maneuvering through the morning traffic, while Rachel held Charlie in the back seat, whispering prayers softly. At the hospital, the efficiency of private care contrasted dramatically with what they would have faced in the public system. Charlie was immediately attended to by a team of pediatricians, taken for tests, and admitted for observation. "The child is in a severe state of malnutrition," explained Dr. Paula Mendez, a woman in her 40s with kind but direct eyes. "This has led to severe gastritis, which caused the digestive bleeding. He will need to stay hospitalized for a few days for stabilization." Edward and Rachel were sitting in the waiting room when they received the news. Rachel began to cry silently, not only in relief knowing her son would be okay, but also in shame for letting the situation get to that point. "Malnutrition," Edward repeated, the word echoing in his mind. "Doctor, is this serious?" "It is reversible, but it indicates that the child has not been receiving adequate nutrition for some time. We will need to implement a strict nutritional follow-up." After the doctor left, Edward and Rachel were alone in the waiting room. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken things. "Rachel," he finally said, "why didn't you tell me that the boy was starving?" She looked up, her eyes red from crying. "How could I say that, Mr. Edward? After everything that happened, after the fight with your sister, how could I come to you and say that I don't have money to feed my own son properly? Because this is more important than any pride or social protocol," he said, and there was something in his voice that she had never heard before. "This is about a child's life." "I know that. Do you think I don't know?" Rachel exploded, all the tension and guilt of the past weeks coming out at once. "Do you think it's easy for a mother to see her child starving and not be able to do anything? I work hard, Mr. Edward. I work as much as I can, but my salary barely covers the rent and transportation. There is very little left for food." Edward remained silent, processing her words. For the first time in a long time, he was confronted with a reality he had forgotten existed. The reality of those who live with few resources, who have to choose between paying rent or buying food, who work hard but still cannot adequately provide for their family. "How much do you earn?" he asked. "A minimum wage and a half," she replied softly. $1,800 a month. Edward did the calculations mentally. Rent in East Los Angeles cost at least $800. Transportation to and from the neighborhood every day cost another $400. That left $600 for food, clothing, medicine, and all the other necessities of a mother and child. It was impossible to live with dignity. With that amount, why didn't you ever ask for a raise? Rachel looked at him as if he had asked the most absurd question in the world. "Mr. Edward, housekeepers don't ask for raises. Housekeepers are grateful to have a job." The brutal simplicity of the answer hit Edward like a slap. He remembered his own mother, who worked in households and had never, in her entire life, asked for a salary increase. She always thanked for the opportunity to work, even when she was clearly being exploited. At that moment, while they awaited news about Charlie's condition, Edward found himself confronted with an uncomfortable truth about himself and how he had always treated those who worked for him. It wasn't deliberate cruelty. It was simply blindness. The blindness of someone who never had to worry about the price of bread or the electricity bill. "Rachel," he finally said, "things are going to change. Regardless of the DNA results, things are going to change." She looked at him with a mix of hope and skepticism. She had heard promises before from other employers in other jobs, but something in Edward's voice, something in the way he had acted that day, taking her son to the hospital without hesitation, paying for the care without flinching, made her believe that maybe, this time, things could really be different. On the other side of the city, in her apartment in Malibu, Patricia was receiving a phone call from a friend who worked at the hospital, informing her about Charlie's hospitalization. A bitter smile formed on her lips. Perfect, she thought. Now they will use the sick boy to gain even more sympathy from Edward. She didn't know she was completely wrong. Charlie's illness was not being used to manipulate anyone. It was simply revealing, in a raw and painful way, the true inequalities that existed in that household, forcing Edward to confront questions he had ignored for too long. Charlie was hospitalized for 5 days at St. Mary's Hospital, and during that time, Edward found himself doing something he hadn't done in years, canceling important meetings to spend time at the hospital. He told himself it was just social responsibility, that any decent employer would do the same. But the truth was he genuinely cared about the boy. On Friday morning, when the DNA results arrived by email at the law firm Edward had hired, he was sitting by the hospital bed where Charlie was sleeping, recovering from treatment. Rachel was in the chair across, knitting a beanie for her son, an activity that calmed her during tense moments. Edward's phone buzzed with the email notification. He looked at the screen and saw the sender, Gene Tech Laboratory, kinship analysis result. His heart raced. "Rachel," he said softly, so as not to wake Charlie. "The results are in." Her hand stopped knitting immediately. "Are you going to open it now?" "I think so. Do you want to know together?" She nodded nervously. Edward opened the email and read silently, his face revealing nothing. The document was technical, full of numbers and percentages, but the conclusion was clear. Genetic compatibility confirms distant familial relationship among the tested participants. Edward read it twice to make sure he understood correctly. Then, he read it a third time. Finally, he looked up at Rachel. "It's true," he said simply. "You are our relative." The silence that followed was deafening. Rachel dropped the knitting on the floor, her hands visibly trembling. Edward kept looking at her, trying to process what that revelation meant for all of them. "Oh my God," Rachel murmured, bringing her hands to her face. "It's really true. My grandmother always said we had family in Los Angeles, but I never imagined. According to the report, you share a common ancestor 3 generations back. This means you are," Edward calculated mentally, "my adoptive father's 3rd cousin." The irony of the situation did not escape either of them. Rachel had spent 2 years serving a family of which she was a rightful blood member. Charlie, the boy who had been treated coldly and had gone hungry, was actually a legitimate Santana. "Mr. Edward," Rachel said in a weak voice, "what does this mean now? What will happen to us?" Before he could respond, Charlie stirred in the bed and opened his eyes. The boy looked visibly better after the treatment, with more color in his face and a brightness in his eyes that had been absent in recent weeks. "Mommy? Mr. Edward?" he said sleepily. "Why do you both look sad?" Rachel forced a smile. "We're not sad, my love. We're surprised." "Surprised about what?" Edward looked at the boy, seeing him now in a completely different light. That child was blood of his blood. He was family. The same boy he had rejected when he asked for food was actually his great-nephew. "Charlie," Edward said, approaching the bed, "how would you feel if I told you that you and your mother are part of our family?" The boy frowned, confused. "What do you mean, Mr. Edward? What if you were my relative? If you had the right to be in our house not as a visitor, but as family?" Charlie thought for a moment, with the seriousness that only children can have. "Does that mean I could eat at the big table and play in the garden without having to hide?" The simplicity of the question hit Edward like a punch in the stomach. For 2 years, that child had lived like a ghost in a house that, by right, was also hers. "Yes," he said, his voice choked. "It would mean exactly that." At that moment, Edward's phone rang. It was Mrs. Helen, calling from the private hospital where she had been admitted the day before for routine exams. "Edward, how is the boy?" "He's fine, Mother. Getting much better. But we have important news." "What news?" Edward took a deep breath before. "The DNA results have arrived. It's positive. Rachel is indeed our relative." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for so long that Edward thought the call had dropped. "Mother? Are you listening?" "I am, my son," replied Mrs. Helen with an emotional voice. "I'm just processing. After so many years, Anthony has finally come home. Through her. What do we do now? What is right, Edward? What should have always been done?" After hanging up the phone, Edward found himself facing a decision that would change not only his life, but the lives of his entire family. Acknowledging Rachel as a relative meant much more than a sentimental issue. It meant legal, financial, and hereditary matters. It meant facing the wrath of Patricia and possibly other relatives. It meant taking on responsibilities he had ignored for 2 years. But looking at Charlie in the hospital bed, still fragile, but with a shy smile on his face, Edward knew there was no real choice. The moral choice had been made the moment the results came in. "Rachel," he said, "when Charlie is discharged, you all will go home. To our house. To the house that has always rightfully belonged to you." "Mr. Edward, I don't know if—" "Not as housekeepers," he interrupted. "As family. As part of the Smith family." Rachel began to cry, a mix of relief, gratitude, and terror for what was to come. She knew that accepting this new position would mean a war with Patricia and probably other challenges she couldn't even imagine. And Mrs. Patricia? Patricia will have to accept reality, Edward said firmly. "Facts are facts. DNA doesn't lie." Charlie, observing the conversation between the adults, asked the question none of them had dared to verbalize. "Does this mean we won't go hungry anymore?" The innocent question echoed through the hospital room as a painful reminder of everything that had gone wrong in the last 2 years, but also as a promise that the future would be different. Edward took the boy's small hand in his, hands that he now discovered were of the same family lineage. "No, Charlie, you will never go hungry again." It was a simple promise, but it carried the weight of a complete transformation in the lives of everyone involved. Outside, the afternoon sun in Los Angeles shone brightly over the city, as if the universe itself were approving that moment of revelation and reconciliation. But Edward knew the hardest days were yet to come. Patricia would not accept this without a fight, and turning a housekeeper into a legitimate heir to the family fortune would be a complex and potentially explosive process. However, for the first time in many years, he felt at peace with the decision he had made. It was the right thing to do, and that was all that mattered. The news of the DNA results reached Patricia's ears even before Edward had the chance to officially inform her. Her network of contacts in the medical and legal world of Los Angeles was extensive, and it didn't take long for someone to comment on that interesting situation involving the Smiths. It was Sunday afternoon when Patricia burst into the mansion in the Hollywood Hills like a human hurricane. Edward was in the garden, pushing Charlie on the swing he had installed that morning, the first toy the boy would have at home. Rachel was in the kitchen, no longer as a housekeeper, but as a family member, preparing Sunday lunch alongside the cook. "Edward!" Patricia's shout echoed throughout the garden, startling the birds into flight from the trees. Edward, get out here now. Charlie was startled and stopped swinging. Mr. Edward, is the angry woman back? Stay here playing, Charlie. I'll handle this, Edward said, walking toward the house with firm steps. He found Patricia in the living room, pacing back and forth like a caged lioness. Her children, Michael and Caroline, were behind her, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Mrs. Helen, just back from the hospital, was sitting in her armchair, watching her daughter with a mix of sadness and disappointment. Is it true? Patricia asked, turning to Edward as soon as he entered the room. Is it true that the test came back positive? It is true, he replied calmly. I can't believe it. Patricia threw her bag onto the sofa with force. I simply can't believe you are doing this to our family. Doing what exactly? Destroying everything our parents built. Handing our inheritance over to strangers. Rachel is not a stranger, Patricia. The test proves she is our cousin. Third cousin, Patricia shouted. That's practically nothing. It's so distant it doesn't even count as real kinship. Mrs. Helen struck the floor with her cane forcefully. Patricia, lower your voice. This is a family home, not a courtroom. Family. Patricia laughed bitterly. What family, Mother? Are we now accepting anyone who shows up with a DNA test as family? We are accepting the truth, Edward said. And the truth is that Rachel and Charlie have Santana blood in their veins. And so what? Patricia exploded. That doesn't mean they have a right to our fortune. It doesn't mean we should support a housekeeper and her child as if they were our responsibility. At that moment, Rachel appeared at the entrance of the living room, with Charlie by her side. She had heard Patricia's screams and decided to confront the situation head-on. Mrs. Patricia, she said in a calm but firm voice, may I say a word? You? Patricia turned to her with sparking eyes. You have no right to say anything. You are an intruder who managed to deceive my family. Patricia, Edward reprimanded, but Rachel raised her hand, asking to speak. Mrs. Patricia, I understand your anger. I understand that this must be very hard to accept, but I want you to know that I never asked for anything. I never knew anything about this family story until Mrs. Helen found the important documents. Of course you will. Say that again. Patricia stepped toward Rachel, her face twisted with rage. You planned all of this from the beginning. You got the job here, gained my mother's trust, and now you're trying to steal what's ours. I'm not trying to steal anything, Rachel said, maintaining her calm despite the accusations. I just want what's best for my son, at the expense of my family. She is your family, Edward interrupted. DNA doesn't lie, Patricia. Third cousin DNA doesn't count for anything. That's so distant that. Patricia stopped mid-sentence, an idea forming in her mind. Unless you're thinking of legally recognizing her, thinking of giving her inheritance rights. The silence that followed was the answer Patricia needed. Oh, my God, she shouted, putting her hands on her head. You've completely lost your mind. You're thinking of giving part of our inheritance to that woman. I'm thinking of doing what's right, Edward said. Rachel is a direct descendant of Anthony Smith. By rights, she should have been recognized a long time ago. By rights. Patricia laughed hysterically. By rights. Edward, that woman worked as our housekeeper for 2 years. Housekeeper. And now you want to make her an heir. The situation changed when we discovered who she really is. The situation hasn't changed at all. She's still the same person. An uneducated woman. With no class, no. Enough. Edward shouted with such force that even the pictures on the walls shook. I will not tolerate any more of this kind of attack. Michael, Patricia's son, who had remained silent until then, finally spoke. Uncle Edward, with all due respect, my mom is right. If you recognize that woman as an heir, our share of the inheritance will decrease. The raw honesty of the teenager's statement silenced the room for a moment. There it was, without disguises or noble justifications, the true root of the issue, money. Michael, Mrs. Helen said with a sad voice, is this how your grandfather and I raised you? Thinking only about what you can inherit. Grandma, it's not his fault, said Caroline, Patricia's youngest daughter. We've always known that one day the inheritance would be ours. Now, suddenly, this woman shows up and... This woman, Edward interrupted, is your cousin. She is family. Family. Patricia laughed scornfully. Edward, family is not just DNA. Family is shared experiences, it's shared history, it's similar upbringing. What does that woman have in common with us besides some genes? Humanity. Edward said simply. Something you all seem to have forgotten. Patricia turned pale. How dare you speak to me like that? I am your sister. I grew up in this house. I have rights. And Rachel has rights too. No, she doesn't. Patricia was almost shouting now. She may have Santana blood, but that doesn't erase 2 years of servitude. That doesn't change the fact that she is a housekeeper. She was, Edward corrected. She was a housekeeper. Now she is our cousin, and she will be treated as such. Charlie, who had remained quiet beside his mother throughout the discussion, finally spoke in his child's voice. Why doesn't the lady like us? The innocent question cut through the air like a blade. Patricia looked at the boy, her eyes filling with tears of anger and frustration. Because you are destroying my family, she said, her voice choked. Because you are taking everything that is ours. We are not taking anything, Charlie said with the simple logic of children. We just want to stay. Mrs. Helen rose from her chair with difficulty, leaning on her cane. Patricia, my daughter, this conversation is over. You are behaving in a way that brings shame to this family's name. I'm the one bringing shame. Patricia looked around the room, seeing that everyone was against her. I'm the one bringing shame when you are giving our house, our money, our social standing to a housekeeper. You are giving our house to a relative who was unjustly ignored, Edward corrected. And if you can't understand the difference, then maybe it is you who doesn't belong in this family. The silence that followed was heavy and definitive. Patricia looked at her brother, her mother, Rachel, and Charlie, and saw that she had lost the battle. Fine, she said, grabbing her bag and calling her children. But this isn't over. I'm going to consult my lawyers. I will contest this in court if necessary. Do what you think is best, Edward said calmly. But the facts will not change. DNA doesn't change, and my decision won't change either. Patricia stormed out of the room, followed by her confused and frightened children. After the turbulent exit, the mansion was immersed in a heavy silence. Mr. Edward, Rachel said in a low voice, maybe it's best if we leave. I don't want to cause more problems for your family. You are not causing problems, he replied. You are exposing problems that already existed. And our family, our true family, needs to learn to deal with them. Charlie tugged at Edward's pant leg. Mr. Edward, does this mean we can stay? Edward knelt to be at the boy's level. Yes, Charlie, you can stay. This is your home now. Outside, Patricia got into her car with clenched fists, already planning her next move. The war was just beginning, and she was determined not to lose without fighting to the last legal resource available. 3 months passed since the DNA revelation, and life in the mansion in Los Angeles had found a new, albeit still fragile, balance. Charlie was now attending a private school in the neighborhood, where he quickly stood out for his intelligence and natural curiosity. Rachel had started a night course in business administration, something she had always dreamed of but could never afford. Edward discovered that she had an impressive analytical mind and had begun consulting her on some aspects of the family business. But the peace was only superficial. Patricia had fulfilled her promise to seek legal resources by hiring one of the most respected law firms in Los Angeles. Although she could not contest the DNA test, she was questioning in court Rosanna's right to the inheritance, arguing that distant kinship did not confer automatic rights to family assets. It was a chilly August morning by Los Angeles standards when Edward's lawyer, Dr. Robert Smith, arrived at the mansion with troubling news. Edward, he said, sitting in the library with a steaming cup of coffee, your sister's office is being very aggressive. They found a legal loophole that could complicate things. What kind of loophole? Edward asked, although part of him already knew it wouldn't be good news. They're arguing that, regardless of kinship, Rosanna signed an employment contract as a housekeeper. They're claiming that she waived any familial rights by accepting a position of servitude in the house. Edward leaned back in his chair, running his hands through his hair. That's ridiculous. She didn't know she was related when she signed the contract. I know that, you know that, but the law may interpret it differently. Moreover, they're questioning whether recognizing kinship after 2 years of employment doesn't constitute an attempt to circumvent inheritance issues. At that moment, Rosanna entered the library carrying a tray of homemade cookies. Since she had officially taken her position in the family, she insisted on continuing to help with household chores, saying she couldn't just sit still. Sorry to interrupt, she said, but I thought you might like to try these cinnamon cookies I learned to make. Dr. Smith smiled politely, but Edward noticed that the lawyer was clearly uncomfortable with the situation. For him, it was still strange to see a former housekeeper being treated as a family member. "Rosanna," Edward said after she left. "Did she overhear our conversation?" "Probably part of it. She's very smart, Edward. Don't underestimate that." "I don't underestimate it. In fact, I found that she understands business better than many people who studied at expensive universities." Dr. Smith hesitated before asking his next question. "Edward, can I be frank with you?" "Always. How far do you intend to take this situation? Recognizing kinship is one thing, but including Rosanna and the boy as legal heirs, that's going to involve a lot of money, a lot of properties. Your sister has 2 children. Your adoptive mother has her own plans for the inheritance. Robert, this is a matter of justice. Rosanna is a direct descendant of Anthony Smith. By rights, she should have been recognized decades ago. But Edward, be practical. She has lived her whole life as a working-class person. Is she really prepared to handle that kind of wealth? That kind of responsibility?" The question bothered Edward more than he would like to admit. Not because he doubted Rosanna's capability, but because he recognized that there was a significant difference between having a right to something and being prepared to deal with it. That afternoon, Edward had an honest conversation with Rosanna in the garden while Charlie played with a new Lego set he had received. "Rosanna, I need to be honest with you about some things." She stopped watering the flowers and turned to him. In recent months, she had gained a confidence she previously lacked, but still maintained the respectful demeanor that had always characterized her relationship with him. "About what, Edward?" He had asked her to call him by his first name, without the Mr., as a family member would. "About the legal action that Patricia has taken against us, and what that means for you and Charlie." Rosanna sat on the wooden bench under the mango tree, her hands still dirty from the garden. "I figured she wouldn't give up easily. She's questioning your right to the inheritance. And, frankly, she may have some valid legal arguments." "Edward," Rosanna said calmly, "I never asked for any inheritance. I just want Charlie to grow up safe, to have an education, to have opportunities one never had. I know that. But now that we know who you are, I feel a moral obligation to ensure that you and Charlie have what is rightfully yours." Rosanna was silent for a moment, watching her son play. "You know what's funny, Edward? For 2 years, I cleaned this house, took care of this family, lived as if I were invisible. Now, all of a sudden, I'm part of the family, but everyone is fighting over money. It's not just about money, isn't it?" She looked him directly in the eyes. "Then why did your sister only get furious when she found out about the inheritance? Why didn't she care when I was just the housekeeper who could be a distant relative?" Edward had no answer for that, because he knew she was right. "Rosanna, what do you want? What do you really want? If you could decide how this whole situation resolves, what would you choose?" She thought for a long time before answering. "I want Charlie to have opportunities. I want him to go to good schools, to have chances to be whatever he wants in life. I want him to never go hungry, to never feel inferior because of where he was born. And for you, for me, I want dignity. I want to be respected for who I am, not for what I might inherit. I want that when I die, my son remembers me as a woman who fought for him, not as someone who lived at the expense of others." The simplicity and honesty of her response touched Edward deeply. "And what if I told you that you could have all of that without having to fight for the inheritance? That I can secure Charlie's future and your dignity regardless of what the courts decide? How? I can set up an educational fund for Charlie. I can ensure that you have your own home, financial security. I can recognize you as my partner in some businesses. You've shown an incredible ability for management." Rosanna looked at him in surprise.